At my mom's funeral, my drunk dad said, "Did you know your mom was my favorite student?" "What do you mean, student?" He realized he exposed himself and told me, "I said too much. Why would she have been his student?" They met at a church event according to the story they'd always told us. I found my brother Clarence by the food table stress-eating finger sandwiches. I pulled him aside and told him what Dad had said. Clarence's eyebrows shot up and he set down his plate. Maybe it's a freaky thing? Like he taught her to bounce on it? He shrugged uncomfortably. That didn't feel right though. Dad's face had shown real panic when he realized what he'd let slip. I scanned the room looking for answers and spotted our grandmother stepping outside. Grandma was on the back patio smoking a cigarette, which she only did when extremely stressed. She'd quit 15 years ago but kept a pack hidden for emergencies. Burying her daughter definitely qualified. I joined her and she didn't even try to hide what she was doing. "Your father's a sick man. I want nothing to do with him." She took a long drag and blew smoke into the evening air. My heart started racing. Grandma had never liked Dad much, but she'd never been this openly hostile. Something had shifted. Maybe it was grief making her honest. Or maybe she figured Mom's death freed her from keeping secrets. "Grandma, Dad said something weird. He called Mom his favorite student. Do you know what that means?" She laughed, but it was bitter and sharp, took another drag of her cigarette and looked me straight in the eyes. The words came out like she'd been holding them in for decades. "Your father was your mother's high school teacher when she was only 16, when they began their relationship." The ground seemed to tilt under my feet. I grabbed the porch railing to steady myself. Mom had been 16. Dad would have been 37 based on their ages. My stomach churned as the implications hit me. Grandma kept going now that the dam had broken and explained how Mom had been a bright student planning to go to college for pre-med. She was top of her class with scholarship offers already coming in. Then her senior year English teacher started paying special attention to her. He groomed her, told her she was mature for her age, special, different from other girls. Grandma's voice dripped with disgust. They'd kept it secret until Mom turned 18. By then, she was so deep under his influence, she thought it was true love, dropped her college plans to be with him. Her parents tried to intervene, but she was technically an adult by then. But you want to know the worst part? Your mother had gotten accepted to her dream school anyway. Full scholarship to study biology. She was going to go despite your father's endless screaming. She had her dorm assignment and everything. Then on prom night, he took off his rubber during intimacy and got her pregnant on purpose so she couldn't go to college. Her and 3 other students. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the porch railing harder, the wood creaking under my fingers while my brain tried to process what Grandma just said about 3 other students. The world tilted sideways, and I had to lock my knees to stay standing. I needed names, needed to understand how many lives my father destroyed. Grandma took another long drag from her cigarette, and the cherry glowed bright in the dim evening light. She told me she didn't know all their names, but remembered one girl dropped out completely right after prom, and another moved away so suddenly that people talked about it for months. The whole senior class seemed different after that night, she said, like something dark had swept through them that nobody would discuss. I asked if Mom knew about the others, and watched Grandma's face crumble like old paper. She stubbed out her cigarette against the porch post, and explained that Mom found out years later when one of them reached out through a mutual friend. By then, Mom had 2 kids, and felt trapped in the life Dad had forced on her. Couldn't see a way out, even knowing she wasn't the only one he'd done it to. The back door creaked open, and Clarence stepped out carrying a plate piled high with more finger sandwiches. But he stopped dead when he saw our faces. His plate tilted dangerously, and he set it down on the patio table before asking what was wrong. I told him to sit down because what he was about to hear would change everything he thought he knew about our family. I explained everything Grandma had just revealed while watching Clarence's sandwich fall from his hand and land on the wooden deck with a soft thud. His face went through. So many changes I could barely keep track. Denial first, then shock, then this sick understanding that spread across his features as pieces clicked into place. He brought up how Dad always insisted on driving us to every school event, especially the dances, and how he'd make these weird comments about the teenage girls that we'd always written off as Dad being awkward. Now those comments took on a whole different meaning, and I watched Clarence's hands start shaking as more memories surfaced. Grandma stood up and brushed ash off her black dress, announcing she was going home because she couldn't be in the same house as that man for another minute. Before she left, she mentioned there was a box of Mom's things from high school in her attic that we might want to look through, stuff she'd saved all these years. She walked down the porch steps without looking back, her shoulders straighter than they'd been all day. Dad appeared in the doorway right then, his face arranged in that fake, concerned expression he wore like a mask. He asked what was taking us so long and said guests were leaving, so we should come say goodbye like good sons. My stomach turned, looking at him standing there pretending to be a grieving widower when he was really a predator who'd destroyed multiple young lives. I told him we needed a minute, and my voice came out harder than I intended. He started to insist, opening his mouth to use that teacher voice that always made us fall in line, but something in our faces made him stop mid-word. He took a step backward into the house, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he gripped the doorframe. He backed away slowly, disappearing into the crowd of mourners, and I could hear him making excuses to someone about how we were taking Mom's death really hard. Clarence and I looked at each other across the patio table, and I knew we were thinking the same thing without having to say it out loud. We couldn't let him just walk away from this, couldn't let him keep playing the grieving widower when he'd stolen Mom's entire future. But we also knew we needed more than just Grandma's word if we were going to expose what he really was. The funeral guests' voices drifted through the open door, people sharing memories of Mom that were all tainted now by what we knew. Someone was talking about what a devoted teacher Dad had been, how he'd shaped so many young minds, and I had to grab the railing again to keep from going inside and screaming the truth at all of them. Clarence picked up his fallen sandwich and threw it in the trash can by the door, his movements sharp and angry. We stood there on the patio as the sun started setting, casting long shadows across the yard where Mom used to plant flowers every spring. The house behind us was full of people who thought they knew our family's story, but the real story was so much darker than any of them could imagine. I thought about those other girls, wondered where they were now, and if they ever got to live the lives they'd planned before my father targeted them. Clarence finally broke the silence by saying, "We should go to Grandma's house tonight and get that box," because he couldn't sleep until he knew everything. I agreed, and we made a plan to slip out after the last guest left, after Dad went to bed thinking his secret was still safe. We went back inside and played our parts, shaking hands and accepting condolences, while our father stood across the room watching us with those predator eyes that we'd never recognized before today. The last guests finally left around 9 that night, and Dad went upstairs saying he had a headache, but I saw him pour 3 fingers of whiskey first. Clarence and I waited until we heard his bedroom door close, then slipped out to my car and drove the 15 minutes to Grandma's small house on the other side of town. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea when we knocked, and she just nodded like she'd been expecting us. The box was already waiting on the counter, an old cardboard thing with Mom's maiden name written on the side in faded marker. Grandma pushed it toward us without saying much, just told us to be careful with what we found inside. We carried it to Clarence's apartment since it was closer and spread everything out on his living room floor. The first thing I pulled out was Mom's senior yearbook from 1994, and there was Dad's faculty photo staring up at me, younger, but with those same eyes I'd never really seen before today. His bio listed him as the AP English teacher and debate coach, and someone had drawn a heart around his picture in pink gel pen. We found Mom's class schedule next, a crumpled piece of paper showing English literature 3rd period with Mr. Dryson. That's what they called him back then. Stapled to it were her graded essays, and my hands got sweaty reading his comments that started professional, but got weird fast. The first paper had normal teacher stuff about thesis statements and supporting evidence, but by November, he was writing things about her beautiful mind and how she understood literature on a deeper level than her peers. One comment from December made my stomach turn, where he wrote that discussing Wuthering Heights with her was the highlight of his day, and that she had an old soul that deserved special attention. Clarence found a whole stack of her homework assignments where Dad had written way too much feedback, sometimes full paragraphs about how exceptional she was, how mature, how different from the other girls her age. There was a folder of permission slips for debate tournaments, and Dad had signed as the supervising teacher for every single one, even tournaments other teachers usually handled. I noticed Mom had perfect attendance in his class, but missed other classes sometimes for doctor appointments or family stuff, like she never wanted to miss seeing him. Then Clarence pulled out this small blue diary, one of those with the tiny lock that's easy to break, and we looked at each other before I opened it to a page marked with an old movie ticket. Mom's handwriting was rounder back then, more girlish, and the entry was dated 2 weeks before prom, talking about how confused she felt, because Mr. D kept asking her to stay after class to discuss her future. She wrote that he said things that made her feel special, but also uncomfortable, like when he touched her shoulder while reading her essay over her desk, or when he said she was too mature to waste time with teenage boys. The next entry talked about him offering to write her college recommendations personally, saying he wanted to make sure she got into the best schools because she deserved better than this small town. Another page described how he gave her a book of poetry, with a note inside saying she reminded him of the tragic heroines who were too good for the mundane world around them. Clarence's face got pale when he found the acceptance letter from the state university, a full scholarship for their biology program starting fall 1994. The letter congratulated her on her outstanding academic record and said her essay about wanting to research childhood leukemia treatments had moved the selection committee. Paperclipped to it was a dorm assignment form and a welcome packet for honors students, all dated April, just 2 weeks before prom, according to the dates. Behind that was a course catalog with classes circled in pen: Bio 101, Chemistry for Life Sciences, Freshman Composition, all the classes she never got to take. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper like it was precious, was a photo from prom night that made my chest tight. Mom looked so young in her light blue dress with those puffy sleeves that were popular back then, standing in front of the gymnasium doors with a corsage on her wrist. Her smile was huge and real, not knowing that her English teacher had already made his plans for that night, not knowing her whole future was about to get stolen. There were other prom photos too, group shots with her friends, and I studied their faces wondering which ones were the other victims Grandma mentioned. I told Clarence we had to find them, that they deserved to know someone finally wanted to hear their stories after all these years. He agreed, but kept rubbing his face, saying this would destroy Dad's reputation in town, where people still called him a dedicated educator who shaped young minds. The next morning I couldn't sleep, so I got up early and started searching Facebook for Mom's graduating class, typing in the high school name and year 1994, found a memorial page someone made for their 20th reunion, and I started scrolling through comments looking for any woman who seemed to have left town suddenly, or never came back. Miranda Carter's name jumped out because under her senior photo, someone had written that she never comes to reunions, even though she only lives 2 states away, that she moved right after graduation and cut ties with everyone. Another comment said Miranda had been so different senior year, went from social butterfly to keeping to herself after spring break. I sent her a message saying I was the son of one of her classmates, that I was trying to understand something that happened senior year, and would she be willing to talk. While waiting for her to respond, I called the school district office and asked about getting employment records from 1994, saying I needed them for a family matter. The secretary told me records that old required a formal written request with a legal reason, that I'd need to submit paperwork and wait 6 to 8 weeks for processing. She suggested I try the state education department if it was urgent, but they'd want the same documentation. My phone buzzed with a text from Clarence saying Dad was calling him nonstop, leaving messages about needing to discuss Mom's will and funeral arrangements, asking where we were and why we weren't answering. Neither of us could deal with him yet, not after what we'd learned, so Clarence texted back that we needed time to process our grief and would talk to him in a few days. That evening, my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification, and my hands shook a little when I saw Miranda's name pop up on the screen. She'd written back saying she'd wondered for years if anyone would ever ask about what happened that year, that she'd carried the weight of staying silent for way too long. Her message was careful, but there was something desperate underneath the words, like she needed to tell someone, but was scared of what might happen if she did. I wrote back immediately suggesting we meet somewhere neutral and safe, somewhere nobody from our town would see us talking. She agreed and suggested a diner 2 towns over where truckers stopped for coffee and nobody paid attention to who sat in the corner booths. 3 days later, I drove out there with my stomach in knots, not sure what I was about to hear, but knowing I needed to know the truth about Dad. The diner smelled like old grease and burnt coffee when I walked in and spotted Miranda sitting in the back corner nursing a cup of tea with her hands wrapped around it like she needed the warmth. She looked older than her Facebook photo, with lines around her eyes that told me she hadn't had an easy life since high school. I slid into the booth across from her, and when I explained what Grandma had told us about Mom and Dad, her shoulders dropped like she'd been holding her breath for decades. She closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, there were tears starting to form. "Your dad pursued multiple students," she said quietly, and my stomach dropped, even though I'd expected it. She explained it was an open secret among some of the girls, but nobody knew what to do about it, that they were just teenagers trying to figure out why their teacher was paying them so much attention. She mentioned another name that made me write it down immediately, Lynette Green, who definitely had something happen with him based on how she'd changed that year. Miranda told me she was one of the lucky ones, because her parents noticed Dad's attention getting weird and transferred her to private school for the last semester of senior year. But she knew others weren't so fortunate, and she'd lived with the guilt of not speaking up, of letting other girls walk into his classroom without warning them. I asked if anyone had tried to report him to the school administration, and she nodded slowly. "The guidance counselor knew something was wrong," she said, and gave me the name Jade Perkins. Miranda said Jade had seemed to suspect what was happening, but nothing ever came of it, that complaints just disappeared, and Dad kept teaching like nothing was wrong. After we talked for another hour with Miranda giving me more details about Dad's behavior, I thanked her and drove straight home to look up Jade Perkins online. Found her on one of those people search sites living about an hour away in a retirement community, and when I called the number listed, there was a long silence after I mentioned Dad's name before she agreed to meet with me. Her voice sounded tired but not surprised, like she'd been waiting for this call for 30 years. The next morning, Clarence came with me to see Jade at her small apartment that smelled like cats and old books. She made us tea and sat down heavily in her recliner before telling us she'd tried to raise concerns about Dad back then, but the principal dismissed everything as misunderstandings. Her hands shook a little as she stood up and walked to an old filing cabinet in the corner, pulling out a folder she'd kept for 30 years. Inside were dates and observations and notes about concerning behavior she'd witnessed. complaints from parents that were never formally filed, patterns of behavior that should have been investigated, but got buried instead. She spread the papers out on her coffee table, and I took photos of everything with my phone, while Clarence read through them with his face getting paler by the minute. There were notes about Dad keeping female students after class repeatedly, about him showing up at the school events where certain girls would be, about parents calling to say their daughters were uncomfortable, but not wanting to make formal complaints. One note mentioned a parent pulling their daughter from his class mid-semester after finding inappropriate comments on her essays. Another documented a girl who'd gone from straight A's to barely passing after something happened during a school trip Dad chaperoned. Jade gave us Lynette's contact information written on a small piece of paper, warning us that Lynette had struggled for years with what happened and might not want to talk about it. She said she'd stayed in touch with Lynette over the years, checking in periodically because she felt responsible for not protecting her when she had the chance. Before we left, Jade mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Pastor Trent from your family's church knew about the situation too," she said, and explained that he was the one who convinced several families not to make formal complaints because it would destroy a good man's life and hurt the whole community. Clarence and I walked back to his car in silence and sat there for what felt like forever, just staring at the dashboard trying to make sense of everything we'd learned. My hands were shaking as I buckled my seatbelt, and Clarence started the engine but didn't put it in drive right away. We both knew this went way deeper than just Dad being a predator, because there was a whole system that protected him while teenage girls suffered. The school knew and did nothing. The church knew and covered it up. Parents who wanted justice got talked out of it. Clarence finally drove us to a coffee shop where we could sit and figure out what to do next. I pulled out my phone and found Lynette's number that Jade had given us and stared at it for a long time before working up the courage to dial. My heart was pounding, so hard I could hear it in my ears as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. When she answered, her voice sounded tired and cautious, but when I explained who I was and why I was calling, she went quiet for a moment, then started crying. She said she'd been waiting 30 years for this call and agreed to meet us, but only somewhere public and safe. We settled on a park the next morning, and she said she'd bring her husband for support, which I understood completely. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about what this woman might tell us and what it would mean for our family. The next morning, Clarence picked me up early, and we drove to the park where we found Lynette sitting on a bench near the playground, with a man who must have been her husband, standing protectively nearby. She looked older than her years, with gray streaking through her hair and deep lines around her eyes that told me life hadn't been easy for her. We sat down across from them on another bench, and Lynette took a deep breath before starting to talk. She explained that Dad had picked her out specifically because she was poor and insecure about her intelligence. Her family couldn't afford college, so she needed perfect grades for scholarships, and Dad knew that made her vulnerable. He started by offering extra tutoring sessions after school, then moved to telling her she was special and brilliant in ways other people couldn't see. The attention from a teacher made her feel important for the first time in her life, and she didn't recognize the manipulation until it was too late. He convinced her that their connection was unique, and that age was just a number when 2 minds connected on such a deep level. By the time things turned physical, she was so confused and isolated that she didn't know how to say no or who to tell. She got pregnant near the end of senior year, but miscarried a few weeks later, which Dad treated like an inconvenience that had resolved itself. He actually seemed relieved that the problem had gone away on its own and told her to keep quiet about everything that had happened between them. Her parents found out when she ended up in the hospital from the miscarriage and wanted to press charges immediately. They were ready to go to the police and the school board and anyone else who would listen, but then Pastor Trent showed up at their house. He sat in their living room and explained how pressing charges would destroy Lynette's reputation and future because the community would blame her for seducing a married teacher. He said the scandal would follow her forever, and no decent man would want to marry her after everyone knew what had happened. Her parents were simple people who trusted their pastor, so they listened when he said the Christian thing to do was forgive and move forward. They packed up their whole life and moved to another state where nobody knew their shame, and Lynette could start over. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she'd thought about Mom so many times over the years. She knew Mom had ended up marrying Dad and always wondered if maybe Mom had been happy with him. Maybe their relationship had been different and real, even though Lynette knew deep down that wasn't possible. When I told her about the pregnancy trap on prom night, her hand flew to her mouth in horror. She realized Mom had been just as much a victim, but trapped in a different kind of prison for decades instead of escaping like she had. Her husband rubbed her back as she processed this information, and I could see him fighting his own anger at what had been done to his wife all those years ago. We exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, and Lynette said she would support whatever we decided to do with this information. She was tired of carrying Dad's secret and protecting the man who stole her teenage years and nearly destroyed her life. After they left Clarence, and I sat in his car again, trying to figure out our next move. We both agreed we needed to confront Dad with everything we knew, but we had to be smart about it. We couldn't just show up emotional and angry because he would twist things around and manipulate the situation like he'd done for decades. We needed a plan and preferably some legal advice about what our options actually were. Grandma had mentioned a lawyer named Warren Hancock who specialized in cases like this, so I called her for his contact information. She gave me his number immediately and said he was expecting my call because she'd already reached out to him. I dialed Warren's office, and his assistant put me through right away. Warren's voice was calm and professional as I explained everything we'd discovered about Dad and his victims. He listened without interrupting, then warned us that criminal charges were probably impossible because of statute of limitations, but there were other ways to seek accountability and protect potential current victims. He suggested we meet in person to discuss our options and create a strategy for moving forward. Warren told us to document everything before we made any moves and get written statements from anyone willing to share their story. The next morning, I started calling Miranda and Lynette again, while Clarence went to Jade's house to pick up all her files and notes she'd kept for 30 years. Miranda wrote out her whole experience in detail and emailed it to me that afternoon, along with photos from that time, showing how young they all looked. Lynette's statement came 2 days later, and reading it made me sick all over again, seeing the specific ways Dad had manipulated her when she was just a kid trying to get good grades. Jade brought over 3 boxes of documentation, including parent complaints that never got filed, and notes about concerning behavior she'd witnessed over the years. We spent hours going through everything and organizing it into folders with dates and names and specific incidents all laid out clearly. Warren came by on the 3rd day to review what we had and helped us put it all in order for maximum impact when we showed it to Dad. While we worked on gathering evidence, Dad kept calling both our phones, leaving messages that started confused, then got angry, then desperate as the days passed. His texts went from asking about funeral bills to demanding we call him back to begging us to just tell him what was wrong. Clarence played one voicemail where Dad's voice cracked as he asked if we were okay and said Mom would want us to stick together as a family. We ignored every single attempt at contact while we built our case against him piece by piece. On the 7th day, Warren called to say everything was ready and asked if we wanted to move forward with confronting Dad directly. Clarence and I looked at each other across my kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of our father's crimes, and both nodded at the same time. Warren suggested meeting Dad somewhere public where he couldn't make a scene, and we settled on the coffee shop downtown near the courthouse. I texted Dad saying we needed to talk about Mom's estate and would meet him there at 2 o'clock the next afternoon. He responded within seconds, saying he'd be there and thanking us for finally reaching out to him. That night, I barely slept, thinking about what would happen when we showed him everything we knew. The next morning, Clarence picked me up early, and we drove downtown, getting to the coffee shop an hour before Dad was supposed to arrive. We picked a corner table where we could see the whole room and the front door and ordered coffee we didn't touch while we waited. Warren arrived 30 minutes later with his briefcase and sat at a nearby table pretending to work on his laptop, but really there as backup if things went bad. At exactly 2 o'clock, Dad walked through the door, and I almost didn't recognize him at first. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week, with dark circles under his eyes and his clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. He spotted us immediately and hurried over with this desperate relief on his face, like we were throwing him a lifeline. He sat down and immediately started talking about Mom's life insurance and the house and bank accounts. But I cut him off by pulling out the thick folder Warren had prepared and setting it on the table between us. Dad's face went from confused to worried as he looked at the folder, then back at us trying to figure out what was happening. I pushed it toward him and told him to open it. His hands shook as he lifted the cover and saw the first page, which was a copy of Mom's acceptance letter to her dream school with the full scholarship. He flipped to the next page and found Miranda's statement describing exactly what he'd done to her when she was 17 years old. The color drained from his face as he kept turning pages, finding Lynette's account and Jade's documentation and photos of Mom at 16, looking so young and innocent. His breathing got faster and his hands shook harder as he saw written proof of everything he'd done laid out in black and white with dates and names and specific details he couldn't deny. He looked up at us with panic in his eyes and started to speak, but the words came out jumbled and desperate. He said it was different back then, and the girls were mature for their age, and Mom was special and different from the others. Clarence slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the coffee cups jump and told Dad to stop talking right now. The whole coffee shop went quiet for a second as people looked over at us, then went back to their conversations. I leaned forward and kept my voice low but steady as I told Dad we knew everything about the pregnancy trap and the other girls and how the church helped cover it up. His mouth opened and closed like he was drowning on dry land as the reality hit him that his secrets were finally exposed after all these years. He tried one more time to salvage something by offering us money from Mom's estate and promising to go to therapy and begging us not to tell anyone else about this. His voice cracked as he said it would destroy the family name and ruin everything Mom had worked for. But I told him he'd already destroyed our family decades ago. Warren stood up from his table and walked over, pulling out legal documents from his briefcase, as Dad watched with growing horror. We gave him two choices right there in that coffee shop, with strangers drinking lattes all around us, having no idea what was happening at our table. He could write apology letters to all his victims and acknowledge publicly what he'd done and donate every penny of Mom's life insurance to a charity for abuse survivors, or we'd take everything to the media and police that afternoon. Warren explained that while criminal charges were unlikely due to time limits, the court of public opinion would destroy him completely, and several victims were ready to file civil suits. Dad's whole body seemed to collapse in on itself as he realized he had no way out and no more cards to play. He looked at the legal papers Warren had prepared with shaking hands and asked in this small, broken voice if we really wanted to do this to him. Clarence told him this wasn't about what we wanted, but about what was right, and what Mom would have wanted if she'd ever been free to make her own choices. Dad signed the papers right there with his hand barely able to hold the pen steady, while Warren witnessed everything and made it all legally binding. Warren said he'd be in touch about the details and timeline for everything Dad had agreed to do, then packed up his briefcase and left us sitting there with our father. Dad looked at us one more time with tears running down his face and asked if we could ever forgive him, but neither of us answered because some things can't be forgiven. He stood up slowly like an old man and walked out of the coffee shop while we sat there watching him go, knowing it was the last time we'd see him like that, with any power left. Warren called me the next morning saying Dad had already started writing the first letter and wanted him to review it before sending it to Miranda. I drove to Warren's office and found Dad there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, hunched over a yellow legal pad, crossing out words and starting over. Warren showed me what Dad had written so far, and it was mostly excuses dressed up as apologies, talking about how times were different and how the girls seemed older than they were. Warren made him rewrite it completely, focusing on taking actual responsibility without any justification or explanation of his actions. Dad's hand shook as he wrote the new version, admitting he'd abused his position of trust and caused real harm that couldn't be undone. Over the next 2 weeks, this became the pattern, with Dad writing drafts and Warren rejecting them until they actually acknowledged what he'd done without making himself the victim. Some of the women didn't want to hear from him at all, which Warren said was completely their right after what they'd been through. Miranda accepted her letter and told Warren it helped her finally stop blaming herself for not fighting harder against his manipulation when she was just a teenager. Lynette took her letter but didn't respond, and we understood that silence was her way of processing decades of pain. The hardest part came when we had to tell the extended family what was really happening, since rumors were already spreading through our small town. Clarence and I sat down with our aunts and uncles at my apartment and laid out the evidence we'd gathered, watching their faces go from confusion to horror to anger. Dad's sister refused to believe it at first, saying we were making things up to steal Mom's money. But when we showed her the documentation from Jade and the victim's statements, she went quiet. His brother just kept shaking his head, saying he'd noticed things over the years, but never wanted to believe his suspicions were real. Mom's cousins were furious that we'd kept this hidden for even a few weeks after discovering it, but we explained we needed to build an airtight case first. The community reaction split right down the middle, with some people calling us liars, trying to destroy a grieving man, while others admitted they'd always felt something was off about Dad. At the grocery store, people would either avoid eye contact completely or corner us to share their own stories about inappropriate comments Dad had made over the years. The local newspaper picked up the story after someone leaked information, and suddenly our family's private nightmare became public entertainment for the whole town to discuss. Pastor Trent showed up at my door 3 weeks after the coffee shop meeting with his Bible in hand, talking about forgiveness and healing and how the church needed to come together. I told him we had documentation of his role in covering up Dad's crimes and helping silence the victims, which made his face go white. He tried to argue that he'd been protecting the families from scandal, but Clarence pointed out he'd really been protecting a predator from consequences. We told him if he tried to intervene again, we'd make sure everyone knew exactly how many girls he'd convinced not to report what happened to them. The church congregation split into camps, with some supporting Dad and saying we should show Christian mercy, while others finally admitted they'd seen warning signs for years. Several women came forward with their own stories about Dad making them uncomfortable at church events or saying things that crossed boundaries when they were younger. One woman said Dad had offered to tutor her privately when she was 17, but her parents had refused because something felt wrong about how eager he was. Another remembered him showing up at high school events he had no reason to attend, always hanging around the teenage girls. The church board held emergency meetings trying to figure out how to handle the scandal while maintaining their reputation, but the damage was already done. Dad couldn't stay in town anymore with everyone knowing what he'd done, so he packed up and moved to live with his brother 3 states away. We put the house where we grew up on the market, and it sold within a month to a young family who had no idea about its history. Clarence and I split the proceeds after making sure the victims got the money we'd promised them from Mom's life insurance as Warren had arranged. 3 months after Mom's funeral, I visited Grandma and found her getting ready to visit Mom's grave with fresh flowers from her garden. She looked lighter somehow, like telling the truth had lifted years off her shoulders, even though she was still grieving her daughter. At the cemetery, she knelt by Mom's headstone and started talking to her like she was really there, apologizing for not protecting her better when she was young. She visited every day after that, bringing different flowers and having long conversations about everything she'd wanted to say while Mom was alive but couldn't. Miranda called me one day saying she and Lynette had been meeting for coffee and wanted to start a support group for survivors of teacher abuse. They'd already found 2 other women who'd experienced similar situations, though not with Dad, and thought it might help to process their shared trauma together. They invited me and Clarence to join them since we were secondary victims, dealing with our own complicated feelings about learning the truth about our father. The first meeting was awkward with everyone unsure how to start, but gradually people began sharing their stories and finding comfort in not being alone. Jade started working with the current school administration, using what happened with Dad as a case study for training teachers to recognize grooming behaviors. She developed a whole presentation about warning signs and proper boundaries, making sure current students would be better protected than her generation was. Several teachers told her afterward that they'd noticed concerning behavior from colleagues, but hadn't known how to report it properly until her training. Warren helped us set up a scholarship fund in Mom's name specifically for young women studying biology, since that had been her dream before Dad stole it. The first recipient was a girl from Mom's old high school who had the same bright determination Mom had shown in the photos from before she met Dad. We presented the scholarship at the school's award ceremony, and I talked about Mom's love of science without mentioning why she never got to pursue it. Clarence started seeing a therapist to work through his complicated feelings about the father he'd thought he knew versus the predator we'd discovered. Some days were harder than others, when a memory would surface that seemed innocent at the time, but now had sinister undertones he couldn't ignore. 6 months passed before I felt ready to write about what we'd discovered. I sat at my laptop for 3 days straight, typing and deleting and typing again, until I had something that felt right. The editor at the magazine asked for more details about the school's role, and I spent another week digging through old yearbooks and tracking down retired teachers. The article went live on a Tuesday morning, and by noon, my phone was buzzing nonstop with messages from people who'd read it. Teachers from across the country reached out saying they'd seen similar patterns at their schools, but nobody ever did anything about it. Miranda called that afternoon crying because seeing it all written out made her feel less alone after all these years. The article got shared over 50,000 times in the first week, and 3 other publications asked me to write follow-ups about institutional failures. I turned them down because I'd said what I needed to say and didn't want to milk Mom's story for content. A year after that first article came out, Miranda called with news that made me sit down hard on my kitchen floor. She'd gone back to the school and just graduated with her counseling degree, specializing in trauma from authority figures. She said confronting Dad had broken something loose inside her, and she wanted to help other survivors find their voice too. Her practice opened 2 months later in a small office downtown, and within weeks, she had a full schedule of clients. The school district finally announced they were doing a full review after my article, and 2 other stories came out about teachers from the same era. They hired an outside firm to go through 40 years of personnel files and complaint records that had been buried in storage. The investigation took 8 months and found 2 other teachers with multiple red flags that got ignored just like Dad's. The district held a press conference where they apologized to all victims and promised new policies to prevent this from happening again. 3 families filed lawsuits after the report came out, and the district settled quietly out of court. Pastor Trent announced his retirement 6 months after the school district report, citing health concerns, but everyone knew the real reason. Several families had confronted the church board about his role in silencing victims and threatened to go public if he stayed. His replacement was a younger minister named Dre, who made his first sermon about protecting the vulnerable and holding leaders accountable. The church lost about 30 members who thought we'd been too harsh on Trent, but gained new ones who appreciated the transparency. Through all of this, Clarence and I met for dinner every Thursday without fail. We'd never been that close growing up, but working through this mess together changed something between us. We started new traditions like taking road trips on Mom's birthday instead of visiting the cemetery where Dad might show up. We cooked her favorite recipes together, even though neither of us inherited her skill in the kitchen. We talked about the good memories we had of her before we knew the truth, and tried to separate the mother we loved from the victim she'd been. Grandma seemed to get younger after telling the truth, even as her body got older. She started going to water aerobics and joined a book club, and even went on a cruise with her friend Margaret. She'd visit Mom's grave every Sunday, and I'd sometimes find her there just sitting on the bench talking like Mom was sitting next to her. 4 years after Mom's funeral, Grandma had a stroke while working in her garden. The doctor said it was quick, and she probably didn't suffer much. We found a letter in her desk addressed to us, saying she was ready and grateful she'd finally done right by her daughter. She wanted to be buried next to Mom and asked that Dad not be told about the funeral. We honored both requests and kept the service small with just family and close friends who'd known the truth. The 5th anniversary of Mom's death fell on a perfect spring day with the kind of weather she'd loved. Clarence and I organized a celebration at the park where she used to take us as kids. Miranda drove in from 2 states away, and Lynette brought her teenage daughter who was studying biology, just like Mom had wanted to. Warren came with his wife, and Jade brought photo albums from the years before Dad entered Mom's life. We shared stories about the girl who'd won science fairs and tutored struggling students, and dreamed of discovering new medicines. Miranda talked about how Mom had helped her with calculus, even though they were in the same grade, because Mom just understood numbers in a way that seemed like magic. Lynette remembered Mom organizing a fundraiser for new lab equipment because the school's microscopes were ancient and broken. Nobody mentioned Dad or what he'd done, because this day was about celebrating who Mom really was underneath everything else. After everyone left, Clarence and I drove to the cemetery with the flowers we'd picked from Grandma's old garden that morning. I'd brought something else too, wrapped carefully in tissue paper in my jacket pocket. The acceptance letter from the university had yellowed with age, but Mom's name was still clear at the top. I smoothed it out and placed it against her headstone next to the fresh flowers. Clarence put his hand on my shoulder as we stood there in the late afternoon sun. We hadn't forgiven Dad because some things can't be forgiven, but we'd found our own kind of peace. Mom's story would live on through Miranda's clients and the new policies at schools and all the girls who'd be protected because people finally knew what to watch for now. Thanks for sticking with me through all this. It's definitely been a journey worth sharing. Until we meet again, folks. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.